You know those conversations, right? The ones that always seem to happen around the holidays at the dinner table,
Oh, yeah.
and they always escalate into, okay, boomer or, kids these days and their phones.
Always. It's like clockwork.
We all hear it. And this constant chatter about generations, about who's right or who's wrong, it really does shape how we see each other and, frankly, how we see ourselves in the big picture.
Yeah.
So today, we're diving deep into that exact conversation.
And what's really fascinating, I think, and maybe a bit of a surprise, is that this whole idea, this way we meticulously label people by generation, and more importantly, let those labels become points of conflict, it's actually pretty modern.
Really? That's quite a statement. How modern are we talking?
Well, think about it. Before the 20th century, the word generation was much simpler. It just meant family lineage.
Like my parents, their parents,
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
Exactly. Your grandparents' generation, your parents, your kids. It was a straight line, family descent, all about bloodlines, not really about shared, cultural experiences across the whole society.
Huh. So nobody in the 1800s was complaining about those darn millennials then.
Not a chance. This broader idea of these distinct generational groups, it only really started popping up later. Sociologists and, interestingly, marketers, they started defining these big
That's
groups.
huh?
Yeah, based on shared birth years and, this is key, common experiences that really shaped how they saw the world. Think huge wars or maybe big tech revolutions.
Ah,
And
okay. So less about the family tree, more about a shared moment in history. That's a big shift.
it is.
So our mission today is to really break down each of these unique generational groups. We're going to look at their specific time frames, the huge world-shaping challenges they faced, what made them unique in their outlook,
Yeah.
and their defining skills and contributions. We want to shed some light on where you might fit into this whole story and what lessons we can actually learn from each of these different times.
Exactly. Because understanding this stuff, it goes way beyond just winning that family argument, right?
Right.
It gives you incredible insight into bigger societal trends, the political stuff we see, even like our own personal relationships.
Hmm.
It helps cut through the noise, find those surprising connections, those human stories that really link us all.
Well said. So let's start unpacking this generational puzzle. We'll begin our journey way back, early 20th century.
Yeah, sounds like a good place to start. See how these first groups got defined and what shaped them.
Okay, first up, the Lost Generation, born roughly between 1883 and 1900.
Okay, so picture this. You're young, you're just coming of age, but the entire world is literally exploding around you. This generation, they grew up, they came into adulthood during World War I, 1914 to 1918.
Yeah.
It wasn't some far-off news story. It was like the grim, muddy reality of their youth, trenches, gas masks.
It's hard to really wrap your head around the scale of that war.
Yeah.
70 million people mobilized worldwide. That led to, what, 8.5 million killed, 21 million wounded?
Yeah, staggering numbers, and then another 2 million soldiers dying from disease. Imagine witnessing that kind of loss, that scale of death so early in life. How does that shape you differently than, say, growing up in peacetime?
Right. It must leave a deep mark.
Absolutely. This war had new, terrifying tech trench warfare, chemical weapons. It just shredded old ideas about glory and heroism. It created this deep, deep disillusionment, a real questioning of authority and purpose that really defined them.
And if the war wasn't enough,
Right. Then came the Spanish flu pandemic, swept the globe from 1918 to 1920, right after the war ended. The death toll estimates are just mind-boggling. Anywhere from 17 million up to maybe 100 million lives lost
yeah,
worldwide.
unbelievable back-to-back catastrophes. And that name, Lost Generation, it came from Gertrude Stein, the writer, right?
Yeah, famously, she saw this existential crisis in the war survivors, this feeling of being lost, questioning life's point, just deep disillusionment. It made some just wander or become expats, like the artists and writers who hung out in her Paris salon.
So for them, it was like the generation had lost its way, its moral compass, after seeing something so terrible.
Exactly. But what's also tragic is that in Europe, the name was even more literal. It meant the millions of young men who were just gone, physically lost to the war, whole communities wiped out.
Wow.
And, ironically, it also kind of echoed what older generations always seem to say. People in the 1920s probably looked at the youth and the flappers, speakeasies, the Charleston dance, and thought, wow, these young people are really lost.
Huh. So, yeah, the generational complaints, maybe they're timeless. It's just a cycle.
Seems like it sometimes.
And beyond the war and the flu, this generation also faced major economic problems, which eventually just spiraled into the Great Depression in the 1930s.
Yeah, another huge blow. But it solidified their resilience, you know? That period meant sky-high unemployment, widespread poverty, just this general feeling of hopelessness hanging over everything.
Yet, despite all that hardship, they were survivors, incredibly resilient.
Definitely.
And something really unique about this generation, they were one of the first to really experience a childhood that was, relatively speaking, free from child labor.
That's a really good point. As laws started restricting child labor around the turn of the century, if you were born, say, mid-1890s or later, you were much less likely to be stuck in a factory or a mine at age 8, which was totally different from generations before them.
That's a huge societal shift, isn't it? Allowing for an actual period of childhood.
Mm.
And building on that, they were also among the first kids to widely play with the same mass-produced toys, like wooden blocks, marbles, rag dolls.
Right. It seems small, but having those shared toys, that shared play experience, it helped create this common cultural bond among kids growing up at the same time, something earlier generations didn't really have in the same way.
Interesting. And speaking of big changes, their time saw the rise of truly independent women.
Yeah, that was significant. During World War I, women stepped into jobs traditionally held by men because the men were fighting.
Filling factory roles, driving ambulances.
Exactly. And while a lot returned to traditional roles afterward, a significant number chose to keep working, live independently, pursue careers. Plus, the literal shortage of men because of the war meant some women just opted for unconventional, unmarried lives. That really started to redefine what society expected of women.
This generation also saw a level of media saturation that was totally new for its time.
Hmm.
Before them, media was mostly local, but by the 1920s, radio became huge.
Oh, yeah. Radio changed everything. Imagine families gathering around hearing news, entertainment in real time from all over the country. It created this new sense of national connection.
And things like the phonograph, more telephones,
Mm.
the human voice itself became really important for culture and connection.
Absolutely. It flattened out regional differences, spread national ideas faster than ever before, and then you had the movies.
Right, the birth of Hollywood, the silent film era. Movies became this massive public entertainment.
And on top of all that, you have electricity becoming way more common, household appliances like vacuums, washing machines.
Making life easier.
Yeah. And cars becoming popular, even airplanes starting to capture the imagination. So much change all at once.
Now, it's really important we talk about the Harlem Renaissance here. This incredible cultural explosion happened right during this generation's formative years.
Yes, absolutely crucial. This amazing surge of art, writing, music, intellectual thought among African Americans in Harlem, New York. We're talking giants like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston in literature,
Yeah, defining voices.
and musicians like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong. Their jazz basically was the soundtrack of the era.
It was so influential it became known as the Jazz Age, right? Which speaks volumes about the creativity and resilience coming from the Black community, even facing immense difficulties.
Definitely. And we need to remember the context for African Americans then. They were born after Reconstruction, but facing devastating Jim Crow laws, institutionalized segregation, disenfranchisement, especially in the South.
Yeah, really oppressive system.
But despite that, this generation saw the start of the Great Migration, African Americans moving north in large numbers to cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, looking for better jobs, trying to escape the violence and unfair laws in the South.
That was a huge voluntary shift for them, really changed the face of American cities.
Meanwhile, you had Asian immigrants, mostly Chinese and Japanese, facing really harsh discrimination. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was still heavily impacting things, effectively banning Chinese laborers.
Right, and Hispanic Americans, especially in those territories the U.S. had annexed, like parts of Texas, Arizona, California.
They were struggling, trying to hold on to their cultural identity against economic hardship, racial barriers, often losing land.
Yeah.
It was tough.
It's also kind of wild that some of the older members of this generation born right near the end of the 1800s became major leaders in World War II, like Hitler, born 1889, FDR, born 1882, spanning such different historical moments.
It's quite an arc. So when you look back at the Lost Generation, their story really shows how massive global upheaval, this existential crisis, can weirdly lead to this burst of culture.
Yeah, it's paradoxical.
Their early exposure to catastrophe on a global scale, not just local hardship like before it, seemed to rewire their sense of purpose. Many sought meaning in art in those expat communities as a response to a world that felt like it had betrayed them. Their resilience, their adaptation, it teaches us a lot about the human spirit's ability to reinvent itself even when feeling completely lost.
That's a powerful way to put it, yeah. Okay, moving forward chronologically, let's discuss the Greatest Generation. They were born between 1901 and 1927.
Right. So they entered a new century that, at first glance, probably felt full of promise, you know? Rapid progress, excitement, like the world was hitting a new golden age. A lot of optimism, especially for those born early in that window.
A lot of optimism.
Yeah.
But history, as it does, had very different plans for them, didn't it? They lived right through the Great Depression, kicking off with that stock market crash in '29.
October 1929. An event that just wiped out millions of investors almost overnight. The whole economy just tanked. Unemployment soared, up to 25% in some places. People lost savings, homes, widespread poverty, homelessness all across the country.
Just imagine millions of families struggling for food, relying on soup kitchens, maybe riding trains, looking for any kind of work. Devastating.
Truly devastating economic hardship. And just when they thought things couldn't get much bleaker, World War II hits, 1939 to 1945.
A conflict even worse than the first one. Over 60 million people killed globally.
Yeah, it's still the deadliest international conflict in history.
Huh.
And that includes the horror of the Holocaust, genocide on a scale that's almost impossible to comprehend.
So this generation really earned that name, Greatest Generation,
Yeah.
because they either fought directly in World War II or made huge contributions on the home front.
Absolutely. 16 million Americans served, an incredible number. About 39% volunteered, 61% were drafted. The U.S. saw around 671,000 casualties. Their collective sacrifice, their immense effort, that's what solidified the title.
And thankfully, after going through all that hardship, that global conflict, they came home not just to parades and celebrations, but to this deep sense of national pride and an era of unprecedented economic prosperity and optimism.
It's almost like that shared trauma of the Depression and the war forged this incredible unity and discipline that directly fueled the post-war boom, a kind of collective action we don't see as often today.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Indeed. Despite the years of scarcity and danger, they went on to achieve amazing success in business, culture, politics. They effectively built a lot of modern America as we know it.
And their youth saw things like radio, telephones, cars become much more normal, more accessible, right? Changing daily life, connecting society more.
Totally. And it was the golden age of Hollywood. Gangster films, musicals, comedies, monster movies, a huge variety.
Plus the start of comic books. Superman, Batman debuted then,
Yeah.
offering new kinds of escapism and heroes when the world really needed them.
Absolutely. Cultural touchstones popping up everywhere. Music was flourishing too. Jazz, blues, gospel, folk, swing jazz became dominant genres, really capturing the national mood.
And radio got even bigger, didn't it? Millions tuned in for President Roosevelt's fireside chats.
Oh, absolutely. Absorbing news, finding comfort.
Mhm.
It created this amazing sense of national unity during really tough times, shared purpose.
Right, in a very immediate, exciting way. And within this generation, that cultural boom of the Harlem Renaissance kept going strong. Figures like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Duke Ellington became icons.
Yes, but sadly, systemic racism was still rampant. Horrific events like lynchings continued, and you had the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, a terrible act of racial violence where a thriving black community was just destroyed.
Just awful.
Meanwhile, Asian immigrants, mainly from China and Japan, were contributing a lot to agriculture, especially out west in California. But they faced incredibly restrictive laws, like the Immigration Act of 1924, which basically banned Asian immigration.
And Mexican laborers.
They became really vital to the U.S. economy, especially farming, through things like the Bracero program, which started in the 40s, bringing in guest workers. But many still face segregation and really exploitative working conditions.
So their core traits, usually described as disciplined, determined, incredibly resilient, qualities forged in hardship, right?
Exactly. They had this practical ingenuity, finding solutions because they had to.
Notable figures include people like JFK, Audrey Hepburn, Frank Sinatra, Alan Turing, Grace Hopper, quite a mix of leadership, culture, science.
A remarkable group. Their legacy, triumphing over adversity, that unwavering resilience, it still resonates today. It shows a level of grit we just don't see as often. Seriously, if you're lucky enough to know someone from this generation and there aren't many left, ask them for a story. You'll hear incredible things about living through the Depression, wartime, stories of survival, perseverance. It's powerful stuff.
Absolutely. Okay, so emerging in the shadow of such a huge generation came the silent generation, born between 1928 and 1945.
Right, the silent ones. They grew up with their parents seeing the fall of Nazism, but then the terrifying rise of communism as this new major enemy. As they came of age right after World War II, they faced a world order that was shattered. And the Soviet Union betraying post-war agreements just plunged the world into the Cold War. 50 years of it.
So a different kind of global tension, this constant pervasive dread hanging over their youth.
Absolutely. And the Depression deeply shaped their childhoods, too. It instilled this real sense of frugality. They dealt with unsettled times, wartime rationing. Many saw parents go off to fight. They grew up in environments that were very patriotic, but also anxious. Sacrifice was just expected.
And this is where that name, Silent Generation, really clicks into place, isn't it? Why
Yeah.
silent?
Well, they were generally expected to be seen and not heard, a huge contrast to the more outspoken generations coming later. And they literally grew up during the McCarthy era.
Right, the Red Scare.
Yeah, a time when speaking out against the government or challenging norms was seriously frowned upon. Plus, you had the constant, terrifying threat of nuclear war hanging over everyone, so maybe being seen and not heard wasn't just a cultural thing, but almost like a survival tactic.
That's a really interesting point. Makes sense. Unlike previous generations who maybe fought to change the system from outside, this generation was more about working within the system.
Exactly. Keeping their heads down, working incredibly hard to build stability. They really had to grow up fast. Learned responsibility, frugality, hard work at a pure necessity. You didn't do it because you felt like it. You did the work because you had to survive, contribute.
Which is why they're often seen as hardworking, dutiful, very traditional in their values.
Right. They were heavily influenced by radio's golden age, the rise of trade unions, which really helped improve conditions and wages for
The
workers.
deal back then.
Huge. And things like transatlantic flight becoming possible, the discovery of penicillin, life-saving stuff, all contributing to that post-war economic boom.
They tended to marry young, have kids young, valuing conformity, stability, traditional family structures, that kind of play it safe attitude, preferring order. It got criticized later by more radical generations who wanted to shake things up.
And for African Americans in this generation, born during the Depression, coming of age during WWII, they faced huge economic hardship, but also found opportunities to serve. Many contributed to the war effort in segregated units, like the famous Tuskegee Airmen.
The first black military pilots in the U.S. forces, right?
That's them. The war also sparked the Del V campaign, this powerful call for victory against fascism overseas and victory against racism at home. It laid important groundwork for the civil rights struggles to come.
Culturally, this era saw the rise of Motown music, jazz, blues continuing to evolve. In literature, you had figures like Ralph Ellison writing Invisible Man, powerfully addressing racial identity, the struggles black Americans faced.
Absolutely. And for Asian Americans, particularly Japanese Americans, this was the time of intense discrimination during World War II. Over 120,000 people, many U.S. citizens, forcibly sent to internment camps under Executive Order 9066.
A terrible chapter.
Terrible. Meanwhile, Mexican Americans played a vital role in the war effort, too, and started organizing more for civil rights, really paving the way for the Chicano movement later on, fighting for things like farm worker rights and cultural identity.
You know, their sort of measured approach, their low-key style. It often means they get overlooked, doesn't it? Sandwiched between the greatest generation and the boomers.
It does. But their quiet dedication, their deep resilience, it laid really crucial foundations for the prosperity and stability that came after the wars. Their discipline, their focus on hard work, building within the system. It's a fascinating contrast to our super noisy, opinionated world today.
Yeah.
It really suggests that huge societal contributions can come from quiet, consistent effort, not just loud, revolutionary change. It's a powerful perspective on different ways to tackle challenges.
Yeah.
Vital ways.
Definitely. And speaking of major shifts, let's move into the mid-century. A new boom was about to change everything.
All right, let's get into the baby boomers. The generation born between 1946 and 1964.
A truly massive group. The name baby boomers comes from that huge, unprecedented baby boom right after World War II. We're talking, what, 76 million births in the U.S. alone.
Uh-huh.
Just staggering numbers.
Absolutely staggering. And it was mostly fueled by a strong post-war economy. People felt confident they could support big families. Soldiers came home wanting to build a future. It was like the whole country just decided, okay, time to make up for lost time and fill up the nurseries.
Huh. Hospitals are packed, nurseries overflowing. The sound of babies became like the new national anthem, a symbol of a hopeful future.
Totally. A very optimistic time. Initially, they grew up in a world seeing incredibly fast progress. The space race was thrilling. The civil rights movement was momentous. You had Woodstock as this huge symbol of counterculture.
Exciting times, but also an age of deep uncertainty, even terror. If the phrase duck and cover makes you instinctively look for shelter.
Yeah. Might be a baby boomer.
Yeah.
Yeah. This was the peak of the Cold War. Nuclear annihilation felt like a very real present threat. Things like the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world right to the edge.
So they were raised initially to be cautious, patriotic, maybe follow their parents' values. But despite that, this is also the time of the Vietnam draft. Massive anti-war protests. Young people openly defying authority. It
Yeah.
was a real turning point, wasn't it, between youth and institutions?
Huge turning point. And you asked how growing up with that nuclear dread might have fueled their later questioning of authority.
Yeah.
Well, that constant threat of total destruction creates this kind of existential urgency, right? A feeling that if the old ways led us here to this terrifying cliff, maybe radical change is the only answer. They lived through huge debates and shifts around the sexual revolution, civil rights, nuclear weapons, diversity, the environment.
A generation really pushing boundaries.
Yeah.
Hugely influential, often more radical, lots favoring left-leaning social causes, pushing back hard against the conservative traditional views of their parents.
And those disagreements got heated, didn't they? A lot of those big political arguments spilled into protests that sometimes turned violent. And maybe not surprisingly, this era saw a big jump in distrust of government, something that only got deeper in later generations.
Yeah, that tracks.
But despite those internal conflicts, boomers had a massive impact on the economy. They were the core marketing demographic. Toys, records, cars. Whatever they wanted, the market scrambled to provide.
And stuff that used to be luxuries, laundry machines, dishwashers, fridges, phones thing. They became standard household items for the average person. Living standards went way up.
Driven by tech advances from before, during, and after the war. Plastics, TV, magnetic tape, transistors, early lasers, all became more common, really shaping modern life.
This long period of optimism and prosperity also fueled a huge cultural explosion, especially in music. The Beatles, Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, Elvis.
Icons, absolutely. They defined a new sound that went global. Boomers were often seen as these superheroes of social change, questioning authority, fighting for rights, pushing for women's liberation. They really grew up believing they could change the world, and, in many ways, they did.
Their characteristics, often described as competitive, confident, sociable, reflects their drive and just their sheer numbers. And it's worth noting, 4 U.S. presidents came from this generation. Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump. Quite a political legacy.
Definitely.
And for African Americans, this was absolutely the generation of the civil rights movement. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, they led the fight to dismantle segregation, secure voting rights, culminating in huge legislative victories like the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65.
Landmark acts, legally outlawing discrimination, protecting voting rights. And then later in the 60s, you saw the rise of the Black Power movement, emphasizing pride in African heritage, self-determination, often pushing for more radical change.
The Black Arts movement ran alongside the Civil Rights movement too, right?
Well,
Artists like Amiri Baraka, musicians like Aretha Franklin, James Brown, using their art to amplify the calls for justice as a vehicle for social commentary.
powerful stuff. The post-war era also saw a big influx of Asian immigrants because of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. That abolished the old quota system, leading to growing communities from China, Korea, the Philippines, really diversifying the U.S.
And Hispanic Americans, led by activists like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, they organized farm workers, fought for labor rights, educational reform, often using nonviolent tactics like boycotts, strikes,
Yeah.
creating a powerful model for future movements.
Yeah, so when you look at their whole story, it's interesting. Many boomers started with this countercultural fire, but their reputation now often leans more conservative. Maybe that comes from reaching economic stability later in life, wanting to preserve the systems they once fought against.
Could be.
And that shift, plus the feeling that maybe they had an easier economic road than later generations, That's a big source of friction with younger groups facing totally different financial realities today. Really shows how the economic context shapes generational values over time.
Absolutely, that's a perfect lead-in. Let's talk about Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980.
Ah, Gen X, the middle child, as some call them, often labeled the latchkey generation.
Right, because so many came home from school to an empty house. Rising divorce rates, more moms in the workforce, more childcare outside the home.
Exactly. They also got called the MTV generation, and sometimes older generations painted them as slackers, cynical, disaffected.
Unless you count surviving childhood without the internet or smartphones as a superpower,
Hmm.
which, honestly, maybe it is.
Maybe. And thanks to demographic shifts like the 1965 Immigration Act, Gen X in America was more culturally and ethnically diverse than any generation before it. That helped offset declining birth rates, made society more multicultural.
Interesting. Now, this generation mostly missed the kind of trial by fire of a huge war that drafted everybody, unlike the generations before them.
That's true. Vietnam was mostly boomers. Gen X saw the Cold War winding down, tensions easing a bit. The biggest conflict for them was the Gulf War, which was more limited, no big draft.
Their fears seemed to shift more to the home front, didn't they? There was that disturbing rise in kidnappings, the whole satanic panic thing in the 80s.
Oh, yeah, the satanic panic, that moral panic linking ritual abuse to daycares and heavy metal music. Bizarre time. And it really marked the end of the free range childhood era, started paving the way for helicopter parenting later on.
So for Gen X kids, it was less about scheduled playdates, more about just figuring things out, exploring the neighborhood, building forts, drinking from the garden hose.
Totally. It bred this fierce independence, resourcefulness. They're kind of like that quiet, competent older sibling who doesn't need constant praise and honestly doesn't really care what others think. They just get stuff done.
That independence really shaped them. They got more involved in fixing things at home, became more willing to question authority, maybe because they saw government trust erode with things like Watergate.
Could be. Issues like LGBT rights became more prominent. And the AIDS epidemic hit hard during their formative years, bringing new urgency to social issues, more awareness about community health.
And technology. They saw that massive shift from analog to digital.
Huge transition. Their music scene exploded with alternative rock, hip hop, punk, post punk, heavy metal, a much more diverse, often rebellious sound, reflecting their skepticism of the mainstream.
Definitely. And tech innovation really took off. Home computers started appearing Apple, Commodore, Atari, video games too. Arcades were huge. Then Nintendo and Atari brought consoles into homes, laying all the groundwork for the digital age.
And education wise, they were way more educated than boomers on average. College became much more common, seen as key for careers.
Individualism, entrepreneurship became big themes for them too. This generation produced some massive tech companies: Google, Wikipedia, Amazon, YouTube.
Pretty huge impact there, yeah. They often entered the workforce during economic downturns, so they got known for being resourceful, resilient, adapting to tough markets.
They were also the first to really push for work-life balance, weren't they? Things like casual Fridays, telecommuting starting to become a thing.
Yeah, they're kind of the original site hustlers too, juggling multiple jobs, gigs, building websites on the side, freelance design before it was cool or even really had a name.
Right. And within the African American community, this generation grew up after the main civil rights movement. Legal segregation was gone, but they faced new challenges: economic inequality, the war on drugs hitting black communities disproportionately, leading to mass incarceration.
Yeah, tough new realities. Figures like Jesse Jackson rose as political leaders, and hip hop culture just took root as this incredibly powerful form of expression, speaking truth to power, voicing urban experiences.
This was the birth of hip-hop, really. Pioneers like Grandmaster Flash, Run DMC, Public Enemy, using music to tackle social issues, challenge norms, build community.
Absolutely vital. Asian Americans started excelling more in education, entering professional fields, which led to that complex model minority stereotype, sometimes overlooking diverse struggles and nuances within the community.
Right, a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
And Hispanic Americans saw significant population growth, more political influence. Leaders like Henry Cisneros emerged, becoming the first Hispanic mayor of a major U.S. city.
So their core traits, often seen as independent, skeptical, flexible. Notable figures include Barack Obama, Jennifer Lopez, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, Michael Jackson, Madonna, Kurt Cobain. Quite a list.
So why did CBS News famously forget Gen X in a generational list once? And why did Gen Xers mostly just shrug?
Huh. That's classic Gen X, right? Their don't care attitude isn't really apathy. It's this deep self-reliance, resilience, born from being left to figure things out. They became masters of adapting practical innovation. They built the digital infrastructure we all use now, often without much fanfare.
Mm.
It kind of teaches us that real impact doesn't always need constant attention or loud self-promotion. Sometimes it's about quiet, persistent work, developing skills, creating lasting things that speak for themselves.
Well put, totally. Okay, we're halfway through, and the story just keeps evolving, reflecting faster and faster change.
Onwards to the true digital natives.
Exactly. All right, now we get into the Millennials, also known as Generation Y, born roughly 1981 to 1996.
Okay, millennials. These are the ones often called digital natives, but they really experienced whiplash, didn't they? They grew up with analog comforts, Toys R Us, wall phones as kids.
Yeah, an analog childhood, pretty much. But then they saw the internet basically explode and rapidly evolve as they grew up.
Mhm.
By high school or college, it was a totally different digital world. They had to adapt super fast, which made them incredibly versatile.
They're like the Swiss Army knives of generations, you know?
Mm.
Adaptable, handy, ready for whatever's next. They navigated huge tech and social changes with amazing agility. They're often called the first truly global generation, too. Connected to the whole world instantly, access to global info and events like no one before.
But also often labeled the unluckiest generation.
Frequently, yeah, because they've faced lower average economic growth since hitting the workforce than any other generation in history, weighed down by massive student debt, which has just ballooned, plus the rising costs of childcare, housing.
And born when fertility rates were dropping globally, they're having fewer kids on average than previous generations, often citing those economic pressures.
They also hit that record low unemployment in 2010, a brutal 19% in the US after the Great Recession. That led to a big spike in youth poverty, tons of them living with their parents well into their 20s, even 30s.
So when they entered the job market during or right after that recession, they got unfairly slapped with labels like lazy or entitled by older folks, when really they were just trying to pay off student loans the size of a small country's GDP while navigating a totally broken economy.
Yeah, the avocado toast jokes miss the point by a mile.
Exactly. The only thing they're really killing is the outdated idea that you must own a house to be successful. Many are more into experiences than stuff, prioritizing travel, personal growth. Explains all the Instagram travel pics.
Huh, probably. And they're great at explaining new tech to their parents while simultaneously asking their younger siblings how the latest viral app works. They really are that generational tech bridge.
Totally. Despite all the economic struggles and criticism, it's interesting. More than 8 out of 10 millennials actually feel confident about their finances.
That is surprising given everything they've faced.
It is. But maybe it reflects their generally positive, optimistic outlook despite the complexities. They're also less likely to be religious than older generations, though many identify as spiritual, finding meaning outside traditional structures.
They're often characterized by that digital fluency, diverse perspectives, a strong sense of social consciousness, very active socially, politically, not afraid to speak up, especially with global news hitting their phones in seconds.
You see a lot of young millennial politicians who are real iconoclasts, reflecting those often highly liberal views that desire for big systemic change.
Yeah. Core traits often include being risk takers, ambitious, sometimes seen as self-centered, maybe a reflection of growing up in an increasingly individualized society.
And for African Americans, this generation saw Black culture go truly global. Music, think Beyoncé, Kanye West, their influence crossed all genres. Film Spike Lee, Ava DuVernay pushing boundaries, sports Serena Williams, LeBron James dominating, becoming global icons.
Huge impact. Asian and Hispanic Americans became much more visible too in entertainment, politics, business. Their food, their cultures became mainstream, widely popular.
It's kind of a trip, but the older millennials are over 40 now. Some are even grandparents already. That's a big shift in their life stage.
Time definitely flies.
Their incredible adaptability, living through so much rapid change, tech, economy, society, it teaches us a lot about navigating constant, often turbulent change. They have this unique mix of optimism and pragmatism. Their journey really shows how humans can reinvent themselves, reorient in the face of disruption, even redefine what success looks like.
It really is a testament to their resilience and reinvention. Okay, moving on, let's explore Generation Z, often called the Zoomers, born between 1997 and 2012.
Okay, Gen Z. If millennials got a crash course in tech and had to adapt fast, Gen Z are the true digital natives.
Born with a smartphone in hand, practically. Almost all of them grew up with the internet just woven into the fabric of everyday life. They got cell phones relatively young, and those quickly became sophisticated smartphones, basically a powerful computer in their pocket from childhood.
Yeah. When older generations say kids these days will never understand, they're often talking about Gen Z and things like,
Typewriters, rotary phones, VCRs, ancient history. Most Gen Zers have probably never used a typewriter, needed whiteout, or scanned a physical newspaper for movie times.
and they'd probably just shrug and ask, why would I?
Hmm.
Research for them is a quick search on a device. A library might just be that place with free Wi-Fi and comfy chairs.
Huh? Pretty much. The way they communicate, consume info, interact with the world, it's fundamentally different. They grew up with social justice movements rapidly rising and a really vicious new kind of American politics, polarizing figures like Trump.
The widespread Black Lives Matter protests
Yeah.
and the totally unprecedented experience of a global pandemic and lockdowns.
Which massively disrupted high school and college for so many of them. Huge impact. They live in this constantly growing attention and dopamine economy, driven by super engaging apps like YouTube and more recently TikTok.
Right. Which don't just change how info is consumed, but what info gets seen thanks to those powerful, personalized algorithms. What's the impact of living in that attention economy 24/7?
It creates this constant feedback loop. Even something like memes, started by millennials as jokes, they've become these powerful tools for Gen Z to spread ideas, movements, cultural touchstones incredibly fast, like shorthand for complex stuff.
Interesting.
This also feeds their individualism, which really defines the Zoomer spirit. It's kind of a return to the entrepreneurial vibe of Gen X, but amplified massively by the internet. Freelancing, the gig economy, those aren't just backups, they're often the preferred way to work. It's changing how jobs are structured.
And social media trends have this huge influence on culture because individuals can now build massive followings, just like traditional media outlets, which leads to jobs like social media creator or online influencer being top career goals, often ranking higher than traditional paths.
It's a different world.
And on a lighter note, culturally, this generation broadly grew up with SpongeBob SquarePants.
Which, yeah, some commentators argue defined culture for their age group more than almost anything else in the last century. Hard to argue sometimes.
Huh. True. For African Americans, Gen Z is really marked by activism, social consciousness. They've been right at the forefront of movements like Black Lives Matter, using social media to amplify voices, organize on a scale we've never seen before. They're highly diverse, super tech-savvy, grew up in a world where representation really, really matters.
Definitely. And African American culture continues to dominate global entertainment. Artists like Lil Nas X, Zendaya are redefining boundaries, challenging norms with their creativity.
Asian Americans have gained way more prominence in Hollywood. Think Crazy Rich Asians, everything, everywhere, all at once. And Hispanic Americans keep shaping politics and culture, with figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez inspiring the next wave of activists and leaders.
Gen Z is highly engaged in politics, social issues. The internet is their key tool for raising awareness, organizing, exerting influence. They've played huge roles in movements around gun control, climate change, often preferring more confrontational protests, digital activism over traditional voting or organizing
Their
methods.
characteristics, often described as highly creative, open-minded, very sensitive to social issues.
They excel at multitasking. They tend to look for the most efficient, easiest way to get work done, makes them resourceful, smart, productive in their own way. Notable figures include Greta Thunberg, Billie Eilish, Zendaya, all wielding huge influence, often through digital platforms.
So how is their unique approach to activism, their deep integration with tech, their different communication styles, how is that going to shape global politics society as they get older and take on leadership roles?
It's a huge question. Their impact is already obvious, and it's only going to grow. It'll be fascinating to watch.
Definitely undeniable. Okay, and finally, we arrive at the youngest generation currently being defined, Generation Alpha, born roughly 2013 to the present, maybe around 2024.
The newest kids on the block, we obviously don't know their full story yet. They're mostly being raised by millennials right now. And they're the first generation born entirely in the 21st century.
These little ones, sometimes called the pandemic generation, experienced the whole COVID thing as very young children, lockdowns, remote learning, a really unique start.
Definitely. They're growing up in a world just completely dominated by rapid tech changes in education, entertainment, social interaction. These kids don't just use tech, they practically emerged from the womb swiping and tapping.
Huh. It's like their first words might have been, "Hey Siri," or Alexa instead of "Mama" or "Dada." They're so tech-savvy they could probably hack your smart fridge before they learn to tie their shoes.
They have this intuitive grasp of digital interfaces, often called iPad kids. And studies suggest they might spend less time on average with parents than previous generations, navigating learning and play more independently, self-directed. They're growing up with a mature internet, almost 20 years old now, deeply embedded in absolutely everything.
Are there predicted downsides to this level of digital immersion?
Some potential worries, yeah. Concerns about increased mental health issues,
Hmm.
constant connectivity, social media pressures, challenges with misinformation, polarization online, especially with nonstop short-form video. Teachers worry about reading comprehension, attention spans.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
And maybe most importantly, they're growing up just as artificial intelligence is becoming this massive societal force ready to reshape industries, daily life in ways we can barely grasp yet.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah.
But despite those worries, there's also this incredibly optimistic view of their potential. They're expected to have an average lifespan of 83 years globally, according to UN predictions. Longevity might just be the norm for them.
And possibly even more engaged than Gen Z. Early signs suggest Gen Alpha is highly engaged in activism, passionate about justice, showing early awareness of global issues, wanting change. They are arguably the most tech-savvy generation ever, not just playing with tech, but creating it.
Right, like that stat about Roblox, more than half of American kids under 16 are on platforms like that, actively coding, designing their own games. It shows this natural knack for digital creation,
Yeah.
way beyond just consuming stuff.
Exactly. Some futurists are already calling them AI-assisted, VR-enhanced, planet-saving superheroes, suggesting a generation deeply augmented by technology, ready to tackle big problems.
That's quite a label.
Their characteristics are often noted as logical, objective, remarkably self-aware. Maybe that's a result of growing up in this transparent, hyper-connected digital world where info and consequences feel immediate.
Any notable figures yet?
Too young for traditional figures, really. But online influencers like Ryan Kaji are huge within their age group already. That signals a whole new kind of celebrity, new role models native to their digital world.
So what's it really going to be like for this generation if things like flying cars become real? Or if tech, like Neuralink, means downloading info straight to your brain? Or maybe even understanding what animals are saying?
It's truly mind-bending stuff. How will they shape a world that feels more unsettled, more rapidly changing than maybe any time since the Cold War? It's a wild thought for the future.
Absolutely wild. Wow. What an incredible journey we've just taken, tracing these generations from the lost all the way to alpha. It really drives home how profoundly each group was shaped by its specific historical moment, those huge technological leaps, the massive social shifts they lived through.
Yeah, from surviving world wars and depressions to inventing entirely new ways to communicate and entertain ourselves. Each generation faced unique hurdles and developed unique strengths. They all left a distinct mark on history.
And through it all, you really see these common threads, don't you? This inherent human resilience, this amazing ability to adapt, and this deep-seated desire to make sense of the world and contribute something to it, even if they went about it in totally different ways.
Yeah. It really underscores that this generational war we hear so much about, it's less about actual hostility and more about fundamentally different life experiences creating profoundly different perspectives. The challenges and actions of one generation just inevitably set the stage for the next. It's this continuous connected story that binds us all.
That's a really important reminder. While these labels are super useful for understanding big trends in history, they are generalizations at the end of the day. Individual experiences within any generation vary wildly. Ultimately, we're all just trying to figure out our own time on this planet, doing the best we can.
Exactly. Which leads us to a final provocative thought for you, our listener. This consistent pattern we see across history, where older generations tend to view younger ones as lost or out of touch. That timeless complaint we talked about?
Yeah.
It isn't necessarily about a flaw in any particular generation. It might actually reveal more about an unchanging human tendency. We tend to react to novelty, to rapid change, with a bit of skepticism, maybe even fear.
A fundamental part of how we process societal evolution. Okay, and building on that, considering Gen Alpha is predicted to be the most tech-savvy, socially conscious generation yet, and with potentially paradigm-shifting tech like Neuralink on the horizon, could their capacity for maybe direct information absorption, maybe heightened empathy, Could that fundamentally change future generational conflicts?
It's really compelling to think about, isn't it? Could they finally usher in an era where deep understanding and collaborative problem solving actually outweigh that historical friction? Could they transform the age-old generational war into something more like a unified human journey? We encourage you to ponder that as you look toward the future.